Mike Johnson mocked Jasmine Crockett in front of America thinking she'd stay silent. Instead, she struck back with a $100 million legal blow that shook Congress and the country. Shocking proof chaos in the media and a ruling no one saw coming. Will Mike Johnson's power survive what comes next? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Under the blinding lights of the U.S. Capitol, the hearing room looked like an arena before a fight. The crowd of reporters and staffers sat frozen, their whispers swallowed by silence. The air felt tight as if the building itself was holding its breath. Everyone knew this wasn't just about political ethics. It was about pride, reputation, and survival. Jasmine Crockett sat tall, steady as stone, her thick folder like a loaded weapon in front of her. Her eyes didn't flinch. Across from her, Mike Johnson leaned back and his black suit lips twisted into a smug smile. His stare carried arrogance, the look of a man who thought he already won. The chairman raised his gavel. This hearing will come to order. The strike echoed like thunder. Every lens locked on Jasmine and Johnson. The silence burned to seconds before detonation. The gavel's echo was still fading when Mike Johnson leaned forward, his smirk turning sharp. He ignored the agenda, locked eyes with Jasmine, and spat each word like a knife. Crockett, you are nothing but a stain in this Congress. A woman of low blood, unfit to sit among us. If you weren't in politics, you'd be serving coffee outside these doors. You bring no value, only shame to this country. Gasps rippled through the chamber. Then silence. Every senator froze, every jaw clenched. The air went heavy, deadly quiet. Reporters forgot to breathe. Camera lights burned hot, capturing faces frozen in disbelief, the shock raw and unfiltered. Jasmine didn't move. 10 seconds passed, long, unbearable seconds. Her eyes stayed locked on him, calm but blazing. The silence felt like an earthquake waiting to hit. Millions watching at home could feel it, a storm building behind her stillness. Then she stood. Her voice cut through the air, sharp and clear. The darkness you just named will cost you $100 million. I will sue you for public humiliation, defamation, and the destruction of my career. The room exploded in noise, shouts, gasps, reporters scrambling for notes. Somewhere a camera light flickered red as hashtags began to surge across social media. Johnson only laughed, bitter and cold, pointing straight at her. You can sue, but you won't get a single dollar from me. The chairman's gavel slammed down, calling for order that no one could restore. The damage was done. What started as a hearing had just become a political earthquake, one already shaking the nation beyond those marble walls. The shockwave hit the hallway before the gavel's echo died. Reporters surged out in a rush of footsteps, phones up, mics, live producers shouting, "Breaking, roll it again." Every screen in the building looped the same sequence. Johnson's sneer, Jasmine's steady rise. The line that cut the room in half played back in slow motion, zoomed and rewound. Lower thirds screamed, timelines flooded, and the clip burned across feeds like a fuse. Outside satellite dishes spun toward the sky, while anchors promised a special report at the top of the hour. Studios flipped to emergency panels. Graphics flashed numbers in bold red, $787 million, Dominion versus Fox News 2023. Legal analysts walked viewers through the memory step by step, connecting insult to liability, microphone to verdict. They spoke of damages, malice, and how a public figure could still win if the proof was strong enough. One commentator leaned in and said, if Dominion can defeat a media empire, Crockett can absolutely defeat the Speaker of the House. The reaction hit Main Street like thunder. At coffee counters, retirees replayed the clip and tapped the screen with a shake of the head. In church fellowship halls, the debate ran between prayer requests and potluck plans. The word Dominion kept returning like a refrain. On golf tees, foursomes paused mid-swing to watch the replay, the ball forgotten, while the score got political. They remembered how that case ended and said Jasmine looked like history, repeating itself only louder. Back at the Capitol, the buzz hardened into a single, unavoidable conclusion. This was never going to end in a committee room under bright lights and marble. The fight would move where paper is weapon and proof is king. Lawyers were called, calendars opened, and filings drafted with precision like a playbook for war. The confrontation was not over. It was only changing arenas to the federal court. The courthouse was a pressure cooker ready to explode. Outside, satellite trucks lined the streetlights, flashing against the marble steps. Inside, every seat was taken reporters, lawmakers, and ordinary citizens crammed shoulder to shoulder. The case Crockett versus Johnson had become national theater. Every breath, every word, every glance between the two adversaries was broadcast live. Jasmine Crockett sat tall, calm but coiled. Across the aisle, Mike Johnson whispered with his lawyers, face unreadable hands, clasped like a man praying to a god of power. Jasmine's attorney rose first. "Your Honor," he said, stepping into the center of the room, "this is not a case about politics. It's about dignity." He raised the remote and the giant courtroom screen flickered to life. The video from the congressional hearing played the moment Johnson leaned forward, voice dripping with contempt. "Crockett, you are nothing but a stain in this Congress." The line echoed through the chamber like a slap. Gasps, murmurs, the faint hum of camera shutters filled the air. The attorney turned to the jury. Those words weren't policy. They were poison. Spoken on live television aimed to destroy her career, her credibility, her humanity. Johnson's attorney stood sharply. Objection, emotional appeal. The judge waved him down. Overruled. Continue. But the defense didn't wait long. They hit back with the same force. "Mr. Johnson is protected by the First Amendment," the lawyer declared. This was political discourse, nothing more. Harsh words, yes, but that's democracy. Freedom of speech must not be criminalized. The defense looked confident until Jasmine's lawyer pressed play again. A new video filled the screen, dated 2021. It showed Johnson at a conservative rally, pacing on stage, microphone in hand, voice booming. "Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is proof that ignorance can get elected if it wears lipstick and smiles for cameras." The room erupted. Gasps turned into outrage. Someone shouted shame, reporters scrambled for their phones. Flashes popped like lightning. Jasmine's lawyer faced the judge. "This isn't free speech, it's a patterned verbal assault disguised as politics." The gavel slammed once, twice, three times. "Order in the court," the judge barked, but no one stopped talking. Johnson's face tightened. His defense team whispered frantically. Jasmine stayed still, her hands folded, eyes steady on him. The moment felt historic, like a courtroom turning point broadcast to a nation that had seen too many men get away with too much for too long. Then came the final blow. Jasmine's attorney lifted a printed email and read aloud. "We must silence the voices of progressive women of color before they overtake us." The sentence hung in the air, heavy as stone. The courtroom exploded in noise, reporters, shouting spectators, gasping senators in the back row, bowing their heads. The judge's gavel pounded again and again. But the truth had already detonated. The calm was gone. The mask was off, and the world had just seen who Mike Johnson really was. After the email, the air turned solid. Silence gathered like smoke until it was broken by the scrape of chairs and the rush of feet. Reporters sprinted for the hallway, thumbs flying, firing off alerts that read, "Email, racist leak." Producers barked into headsets, cameras, pivoted toward counsel tables, and the gallery buzzed with shock. Inside, the judge watched over a room packed to the doors, while the clerk shuffled papers with trembling hands. Every face held the same question: what could possibly calm this storm? Now Johnson's lead attorney tried. He rose slowly, lifted both palms in a show of calm, and spoke in a careful tone. "If anyone feels offended, Mr. Johnson regrets that." The words fell soft and light, like a bandage laid over a broken bone. A few groans rippled. Someone in the back laughed, once short and bitter. The judge glanced up, unmoved, as if hearing a weather report instead of a defense. Jasmine stood. "An apology cannot mend a plan. An apology does not erase a scheme. And justice will set a price on this humiliation." Her voice did not shake. It rang clean, the kind of sound that cuts through noise and lands like truth. Heads turned as one toward her, and even the skeptics in the press row nodded, the balance of the room sliding quietly to her side. Phones kept buzzing on the benches, each alert flashing the same banner: "Email, racist leak." Jurors leaned forward unconsciously, elbows on knees, as if gravity had shifted toward the plaintiff's table. Johnson stared at the tabletop, jaw tight, while his attorney scribbled lines that already felt useless. The court reporter's keys slowed, the gallery went still, and the judge for once did not reach for the gavel. Every gaze rested on Jasmine, steady, unbroken, in command of the silence that followed. The weight had moved. The courtroom was still vibrating from the last exchange when the door at the back opened. A hush rippled through the crowd as a woman stepped inside mid-30s, sharp suit face pale but steady. The clerk whispered her name, and the murmur spread like wind through dry grass. Laura Peters, former senior aide to Mike Johnson. The defense table stiffened. Johnson's eyes widened for the first time since the trial began. Laura clutched a folder so tight her knuckles turned white. The judge motioned her forward. Every camera turned. The air crackled. Everyone knew something seismic was about to drop. Laura took the oath, her voice trembling at first but gaining strength. "I was part of Mr. Johnson's communications team," she said. "I kept records, meeting notes, internal memos, directives." She opened the folder and slid a document across the witness table. The header read, "Confidential Strategy, Brief Pre-Hearing Plan." The courtroom fell silent except for the sound of paper hitting wood. Jasmine's attorney approached the bench holding the memo like evidence from a crime scene. "Your Honor," he said, "this is the plaintiff's Exhibit 42. He faced the jury and began to read. The first line was enough to freeze the room. "Objective humiliate Crockett live on air to destroy her political credibility." Gasps broke out. A woman in the front row covered her mouth. Reporters leaned over the rail, typing furiously. The lawyer continued, voice rising with each word. This was not an accident, not free speech, not passion. This was a plan. Johnson stared straight ahead, color draining from his face, his lawyer whispering frantically beside him. Then came the part that turned the courtroom upside down. The memo's third page appeared on the big screen, zoomed in red circles and highlights clearly visible. The lawyer read aloud, his tone sharp as a blade. "Gold turned Crockett into a national joke. Attack her roots, her gender, her color." The words rang through the hall like gunfire. Someone whispered, "Oh my God." Another shouted, "Unbelievable." The judge struck the gavel again and again, but order was gone. Flashbulbs exploded. Reporters yelled into microphones, "Breaking racial memo exposed." Jasmine didn't move. Her expression was calm, but her eyes burned with controlled fire. Across the aisle, Johnson's composure cracked the faint tremor in his jaw, caught by every camera lens in the room. His attorney pressed a hand to his shoulder, but he didn't react. The evidence was too explicit, too deliberate, too damning. The judge leaned forward, voice measured but heavy. "The court will recess to authenticate Exhibit 42. But the outcome was already clear. Even the defense team looked defeated. The memo had stripped away every defense they'd built, every excuse, every plea to the First Amendment. When the recess was called, no one stood. Reporters didn't leave. Jurors didn't move. They just stared at the glowing screen, the circled words still visible in red ink, a written confession of intent. That was the breaking point. The plan was exposed, the facade gone. The document in Laura Peters's trembling hands had just become the weapon that would change everything. The courtroom was motionless, every breath suspended. Hours of arguments had built to this moment. The judge re-entered, robe, flowing eyes, unreadable, a folded document in his hand. The scrape of his chair echoed like thunder in a cave. All rise. Every person stood, reporters, jurors, aides, the accused, the accuser. Cameras clicked like static. The judge unfolded the verdict with deliberate care, the sound of paper loud in the silence. It felt like time itself was holding still. He looked up, voice deep and steady. "In the case of Crockett versus Johnson, the court finds in favor of the plaintiff." A collective gasp filled the room. Then came the words that would echo across the nation. "The defendant, Mike Johnson, is ordered to pay damages in the amount of $100 million. The words struck like a detonation. The air erupted, half the gallery leaping to their feet, the other half frozen in disbelief. Cheers broke out from Jasmine's supporters, tears streaking down their faces. Hands clapped, phones rose, someone shouted. Justice reporters yelled over each other, calling in headlines as the sound filled the chamber. Across the aisle, Johnson's allies sat paralyzed, faces blank. One man quietly gathered his notes and slipped out the side door, too ashamed to stay. The rest stared at the floor, unable to speak. It was over, and they knew it. Mike Johnson stood slowly. His face had gone pale, lips pressed tight. The camera zoomed in on the tremor in his hand as he reached for his papers. He turned toward the exit, but the press closed in like a wave. Flash after flash exploded, blinding white. "Mr. Johnson," a reporter shouted, "do you still have the integrity to serve as speaker?" Another voice cut through. "Will you resign?" Johnson didn't answer. He just lowered his head and kept walking, shoulders heavy, under the weight of silence. The door closed behind him and the noise swallowed him whole. At the plaintiff's table, Jasmine Crockett rose. The crowd quieted instinctively. She stepped forward to the podium, posture, straight expression, calm but commanding. Her voice carried clear and strong across the room. "This is not my victory," she said. "This is the victory of truth and of every woman who has ever been humiliated and told to stay silent." The applause that followed wasn't loud, it was deep, like the sound of relief after a storm. Even the judge's gaze softened. As cameras flashed, the image froze in 1,000 headlines. Jasmine standing tall, while power bowed its head. The most powerful man in Congress had fallen not to scandal or politics, but to justice. The gavel came down one final time, sealing the judgment. The balance had shifted. The courtroom exhaled as one. The mighty had finally been forced to kneel. The morning after the verdict, the country woke up to front pages that looked like history had been rewritten overnight. The New York Times ran the headline in bold black letters: "History Rewritten, Crockett Wins $100 million Against Johnson." The Washington Post followed with a verdict that redefines dignity in American politics. Every network led with the same image: Jasmine Crockett standing at the courthouse steps, head held high, light cutting through the gray sky behind her. Commentators spoke of shockwaves through Washington, of the fall of a political titan, and the rise of a new moral standard. For once, it wasn't scandal or corruption driving the story. It was about words, their weight, their damage, and now their price. By mid-morning, legal experts filled television panels and podcasts, their voices calm but electrified. Dominion via Fox News was on everyone's lips, the 2023 case that had cost Fox $787 million for spreading lies. "This is the next milestone," said Professor Elaine Carter from Yale Law School. "If Dominion made the press accountable for its words, Crockett versus Johnson makes politicians accountable for theirs." Legal analysts nodded in agreement. They called it a turning point, a constitutional wake-up call, one that forced America to ask if freedom of speech had limits when it crossed into hate. Every elected official in the country, one commentator warned, just got a masterclass in consequences. The verdict became the center of every conversation from Capitol Hill to neighborhood diners. Civil rights groups, women's organizations, and advocacy networks issued statements praising Jasmine Crockett's courage. The National Organization for Women called it a victory, not only for a woman's reputation, but for every citizen's right to be treated with dignity. The NAACP released a single-line statement that spread across news outlets. They tried to silence one woman, and she spoke for a nation. In downtown D.C., posters of Jasmine began to appear overnight, printed with the word justice beneath her face. Crowds gathered in front of the courthouse steps, not to protest, but to thank her. Some brought flowers, others just stood quietly watching the building where a historic reckoning had taken place. Across the country, television screens replayed the moment that had started it all. Johnson's insult, Jasmine's stillness, and the calm declaration that followed. "The darkness you just named will cost you $100 million. Now that line had come full circle. In a small apartment in Atlanta, a black mother sat with her daughter watching the news replay. The mother smiled softly, pulling her child closer. "You see, baby, they can't silence us anymore." The little girl looked up at the screen, eyes wide, reflecting Jasmine's image. It was a quiet moment that spoke louder than any speech, one that producers would later describe as the heart of the story. America wasn't just watching a trial, it was watching itself. Newsrooms buzzed with comparisons to Watergate. Talk shows called Johnson the modern Nixon, a man undone not by a crime of money, but a crime of arrogance. Nixon tried to hide his tapes. One anchor said, "Johnson broadcast his shame to the whole country." The line went viral, replayed across every evening broadcast. Late-night hosts delivered their punchlines, but the laughter was uneasy, edged with the weight of truth. Every clip of Johnson's courtroom silence was replayed in slow motion, the once confident speaker now reduced to a man cornered by his own words. In Congress, the fallout was immediate. Leaders from both parties called for a special hearing on hate speech and political responsibility. The session was tense, in historic, cameras everywhere, members of Congress quoting Jasmine Crockett on the floor. "Justice will set a price on this humiliation," one representative read aloud, her voice trembling slightly. For the first time in decades, the issue of ethics in language, long buried under partisanship, took center stage. Even those who had once mocked Jasmine's courage now stayed quiet. They knew the public was watching, and this time silence would be read as complicity. Meanwhile, legal think tanks across the country scrambled to interpret the ruling's long-term impact. Law schools added Crockett v. Johnson to their upcoming curriculums under the module Speech Power and Accountability. Professors debated the nuances of the verdict, how it balanced freedom of expression with the right to dignity, how it might reshape defamation law for generations. This is not censorship, said one scholar on national radio. This is civilization. Speech has always had consequences. Now the law has finally caught up. But beyond the legal jargon, the human side of the story carried deeper resonance. Social scientists noted the sudden rise in civic optimism among older Americans. In coffee shops and retirement centers, people who had long given up on politics began to talk again about justice, about respect, about why the country still mattered. It reminds me of Watergate, an elderly man in Michigan told a local reporter. Back then, we saw proof that the system could correct itself. This feels the same. For millions over 50, the verdict didn't just restore faith in the courts. It reminded them that decency could still win in public life. For the younger generation, the reaction came in waves of admiration and pride. Jasmine Crockett became an overnight icon. Her courtroom composure, her poise under fire, her refusal to trade dignity for outrage, all of it struck a chord. College students quoted her in debates. High school civics teachers played clips of her testimony as examples of integrity and leadership. Universities began hosting events called the Crockett Conversations, inviting young people to discuss what moral courage looks like in modern politics. To them, Jasmine wasn't a politician anymore. She was proof that conviction could outlast corruption. The ripple effect spread fast. On news panels, political strategists debated whether the verdict would force a new code of conduct in Congress. This changes everything, one said. Every insult, every smear, every calculated outrage on camera, it's all potential evidence now. Corporate boardrooms followed suit, holding emergency HR meetings about workplace speech policies. Law firms released statements reminding partners that words in public life carry legal weight. In 1 week, the entire country was forced to confront the cost of cruelty. Even international media joined in. From London to Tokyo, headlines echoed America's reckoning. The BBC called it a trial that taught the world the price of humiliation. Le Monde wrote, "The United States proves again that democracy, when bruised, still knows how to heal itself." Analysts said the verdict restored moral authority to a nation often accused of losing it. The image of Jasmine standing in the courthouse light appeared everywhere: newspapers, magazines, classrooms. Her name had crossed borders. Her victory had become universal. By the end of the week, something rare happened in America: agreement. Across political lines, religious divides, and generations, people repeated one message. It appeared on talk shows, in classrooms, and sermons, even in courtrooms where new cases began citing her victory. Freedom of speech is a right, but dignity is the boundary, and justice guards that boundary. That sentence became the country's unofficial epilogue to the trial, the phrase that distilled 1,000 debates into one truth. And so the storm that began with an insult ended as a lesson. The story of Jasmine Crockett and Mike Johnson wasn't just about law. It was about the soul of a nation rediscovering its voice. America had been reminded that justice wasn't abstract, that honor wasn't symbolic, and that the law at its best could still protect the unseen and unheard. In a country built on words, it took one woman to remind everyone what they were worth. The verdict of Crockett versus Johnson didn't just end a trial, it began a legacy. Within weeks, law schools across the world turned it into a case study. At Harvard, first-year students crowded into lecture halls, the screen showing Jasmine Crockett's courtroom footage as professors dissected every argument. This, said Professor Thomas Ellery, tapping the board with his marker, is how words become evidence. Across the ocean, Oxford hosted a full-day symposium titled Language, Law, and Power. One student raised a hand during discussion and asked, "Professor, does this mean dignity can have a legal price?" The answer came simply, after Crockett versus Johnson, yes. At Yale Law School, students lined the hallways to take selfies beside the bulletin board, displaying the headline, $100 million for words a turning point in political ethics. Professors called it a new mirror clause for modern democracy, proof that speech when weaponized carries responsibility as heavy as any act. In mock courtrooms from Cambridge to California, young law students practiced re-arguing the case testing where freedom ended and harm began. One student, acting as Jasmine's lawyer, read the email line: "We must silence the voices of progressive women of color before they overtake us," and the room went still. Professors later said no hypothetical case in decades had inspired such emotion or introspection. What began as a courtroom battle had become an academic revolution. Students weren't just studying the law, they were questioning the conscience of power itself. Outside academia, the verdict rippled through global institutions. Human rights organizations issued statements within days. Amnesty International praised the decision, writing, "The United States has proven that democracy, though bruised, knows how to heal itself through justice." Human Rights Watch called it a modern civil rights ruling disguised as a defamation case. The United Nations Human Rights Council referenced it in a public forum, commending a democracy that continues to reaffirm that equality and respect are not privileges, but obligations. Even countries often critical of American politics cited the ruling as an example of accountability. Commentators abroad said it showed the world that power in the U.S. still answered to the people. The Guardian in London ran the headline "Justice as Redemption, the Crockett Principle." In Tokyo, NHK World opened its nightly broadcast with footage of Jasmine's courtroom victory. Anchors explained that the verdict had reset the moral compass of American politics. In France, Le Monde compared her to historical figures who changed systems without violence: Rosa Parks, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Nelson Mandela. The comparison felt bold but fitting. Jasmine had fought not with protests or marches, but with evidence, poise, and truth. She had turned restraint into revolution. And then came the image, the photo that captured the world. Jasmine Crockett standing in the courtroom, right hand raised, oath mid-sentence, light pouring through the tall windows behind her. The photographer, later interviewed by Time, said he had pressed the shutter without breathing. "It felt like history was standing still for 1 second," he recalled. When Time magazine released its cover a week later, the photo centered against a pure white background with one word beneath it: "Dignity." Newsstands sold out across the country. The image became a symbol everywhere: posters in classrooms, murals in New York, banners in college protests, even postage stamps in discussion. The woman once mocked on live television had become the face of justice itself. Across social media and television, commentators marveled at the cultural shift. "We used to glorify power," one journalist said on air. "Now we're learning to respect restraint." Museums began collecting courtroom artifacts, copies of the verdict, pages of transcripts, even the microphone Jasmine used that day. The Smithsonian requested the original memo exposed in court as a piece of modern civil rights history. The trial had transcended law. It had entered collective memory. Politicians, too, were watching and learning. In Washington, speechwriters were suddenly under scrutiny. Advisors combed through old remarks, cleaning up language that once passed as rhetoric. Staff briefings now included a new phrase: "word risk." Lawmakers who once spoke freely now weighed every statement twice. "Crockett changed the air in this city," said one anonymous aide. "You can feel it in every press conference, the fear of crossing that invisible line." Within months, congressional sessions became quieter, sharper, less theatrical. For the first time in decades, silence had become the new show of strength. Even outside politics, the verdict changed behavior. Public figures, CEOs, and television hosts began to issue statements with care. Late-night comedians joked less about personal identity and more about systems and policies. The word accountability became fashionable again. Opinion writers called it the age of measured speech. The change wasn't instant, but it was visible, a collective awareness that words, when aimed like weapons, now came with consequences measured in millions. Meanwhile, ordinary people felt something deeper: faith. Faith that dignity wasn't just a noble idea, but a right protected by law. "It made me believe in the system again," said a teacher from Detroit in a street interview. "For years, we thought justice was for the rich, for the powerful. Now it feels like it belongs to everyone." Newspapers ran stories of individuals citing the case in workplace disputes, in harassment claims, and school policies. Courts began referencing Crockett v. Johnson in rulings about online defamation and political slander. What started as one woman's defense had turned into a national safeguard. Sociologists noted a measurable rise in civic trust. Surveys showed Americans, for the first time in a decade, believed that the justice system could protect ordinary dignity. Editorials called it the Crockett effect. Town halls that once argued over budgets now debated ethics. On local radio callers spoke about honor, respect, and accountability like they were tangible commodities. A preacher in Mississippi summed it up during a Sunday sermon. Our words are no longer free, they're priceless. Use them with mercy. For Jasmine Crockett, the transformation was both surreal and sobering. She kept a low profile, avoiding interviews, speaking only at a few universities. This was never about revenge, she said to a packed audience at Harvard. It was about proving that in a democracy, truth and dignity are not luxuries. They are the foundation. The crowd rose to their feet, clapping not just for her, but for what her words represented: the restoration of moral gravity in public life. Across generations, her message resonated differently. For the young, it was empowerment proof that standing your ground could rewrite history. For the old, it was redemption proof that America could still correct itself. And for those caught between cynicism and hope, it was a reminder that silence, when principled, could be louder than any shout. The photograph of her oath became a permanent exhibit at the National Museum of American History, labeled "When Words Were Judged." As months passed, the echoes of the case faded from breaking news but deepened in meaning. Political consultants began teaching Crockett compliance, a term for filtering campaign speech to avoid defamation. Legal textbooks added a new section, defamation in the age of accountability. Universities abroad followed suit. Oxford updated its ethics course. Harvard built a new seminar on moral language in public service, and Yale launched a symposium titled Dignity as Law. What once was an emotional headline had become institutional doctrine. The long-term effect reached beyond courtrooms and campuses. It seeped into daily life, office meetings, classrooms, living rooms. People quoted her words without even realizing, "An apology cannot mend a plan. Justice will set a price on this humiliation." And the line that came to define the decade in a democracy: truth and dignity are never silent. That sentence, once spoken in a courtroom packed with tension, now appeared in textbooks, on courthouse walls, and graduation speeches, even in church sermons. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.